The purpose of this video is all around the Costa Rican home, and really I'm going to discredit statements or claims either that are found in the indictment, that I've read about in the news, but primarily information that the government has claimed around the Costa Rican home. From my opinion, there's basically two areas that I'm going to focus on. The first area is the fact that we took Vision Quest Capital Resources and built this Costa Rican home. And in essence, they have articulated that this home was built as a luxury personal residence for the Peters family and not as an investment that fit with inside the criteria of Vision Quest Capital. I want to discredit any suggestion at all that this investment was made without my staff's knowledge. Or even involvement. In fact, in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide proof that not only was my staff aware of it and had the knowledge that this investment was being made, but that they were intimately involved in the decision-making, particularly that Steve Laska and Stacy Bean involved in the decision-making, management, and the investment structure that we established in this investment called the House of the Beloved Princess down in Costa Rica. So for background purposes, I was introduced to the Coco Bay area and the development called Coco Bay Estates roughly in 2011 when I was invited down to Costa Rica to evaluate a potential investment in a real estate project in the area. I was introduced to the developers of Coco Bay Estates, Julian Rampert and Jim Carell, through James Taylor, who was the owner of Angel Automotive Group. This is another investment that's been highlighted in this case, and an investment, obviously, that Vision Quest Capital had made an investment into, being Angel Automotive Group. When I got invited down there, James Taylor made the introduction to this development group, and he had already made an investment, both individually and with a group of individuals. Project. My initial investment, made in early 2011, was not in the Coco Bay Estate, where actually the House of the Beloved Princess was eventually built, but rather there was a project called La Montaña, okay, that in January of 2011, I had the opportunity to visit, and I didn't really invest in the development of the project, but there was this very large lot that I felt would be a very opportunistic investment for us, and so I sent down a deposit of $50,000 to secure that lot. Now, what you're seeing here is the contract for La Montaña that was signed in January of 2011. And I held this property, but in about a year, by 2012, and I would say it was probably around March of 2012, over a year later, the project in La Montaña hadn't progressed, and I was actually having some concerns about the project. It was being delayed primarily from, at least what I was being told, it was related to water. There were some other issues that were associated with the slowing down of the project. And so I started to have some discussions with Julian, the developer of both projects, La Montaña and Coco Bay Estates, about some of the options. And as you can see in this email, we were going back and forth, and Julian was laying out some options in which I could get my money back, or if I wanted to continue to make an investment down in Coco Bay, which I thought was a really good area, that I might have the option to transfer my interest from La Montaña into Coco Bay Estates, and specifically Lot 61, which was one of the premier lots in Coco Bay Estates and was owned by Julian and Jim. Eventually, this is what I did. I had a few discussions with Amy, had some discussions with some of my team members, and specifically Nick Kolbenschlag, and in May of 2012, we closed on Lot 61 in Coco Bay Estates. Now, at the time, I did not see this investment as a cash flow investment, but more of an opportunistic investment, primarily a flip. And at the time, I engaged two builders. Those builders were David Garcia and a guy by the name of Michael Brusock. And there's going to be tons of emails going back and forth between these two individuals. But I eventually came up with a plan for building a home, and the idea was to eventually build this home and flip it. Now, at the time, Amy was very much involved. And at this stage, she was very much involved in conversations about the design of the property, how it was going to look, and we really thought that that was going to be a very good investment. But in September of 2012, we bought the farm. And once we did that and we bought the farm, Amy's involvement diminished as the project on the farm started to unfold. And so everyone agreed, even including my staff, because we were dealing at this time with some issues with Fusion Fund. I was focused on developing a new charity and the startup of that, as well as the construction that was taking place on the farm that we had purchased. And so, candidly, the Costa Rican property just went on hold. Now, at the time, I truly didn't see this halt as a problem. The project at the time wasn't a mistake, and at best, from my perspective, we could always, as we received more cash and grew in different areas of our businesses, we could invest and do the exact same thing. We could build something out and flip it. The area of Coco Bay was really, you could see it starting to develop, and I just didn't feel as if I was going to lose. And even being down and around that area where there were wealthy families from both the U.S. and Canada that were investing in the area, it was an opportunistic investment. And if we took a long-term view of this investment, the worst case scenario for me was the initial down payment of $250,000. If I had to carry an 8% interest, we're talking roughly $20,000 a year, plus HOA dues, taxes, and corporate fees. And so at worst case, we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of around $25,000, $26,000 of carrying cost each year. And so long term, I think that investment was going to wind up being much more successful than the $250,000 initial purchase, plus the carrying cost over the next few years. And so I was comfortable with where we were at that time. Now, I do think it's also important to note that we had created 3 entities at the same time when we purchased this land. I mean, this was not going to be the only investment that we were making down in Costa Rica. We thought this area was a growth area, and that over time there would be new opportunities for us to invest in for both Vision Quest Capital as well as Vision Quest Wealth Management to spend its time down there, since we could take advantage of the pockets of wealth that we're investing in and around that area. Simply put, and this would be last on the list, but it did get brought up, and if Steve Laska and Amy Peters are honest about this was a topic, and this topic was that my wife had no interest in being the manager of these Costa Rican entities, and she did not want to manage a Costa Rican project or any additional real estate development projects going forward. And so in the late part of 2015, early part of 2016, Steve Laska was asked to really evaluate and do some independent studies on whether or not holding this land was the best option for us. There is going to be another video that talks a little bit about corporate governance and why Steve Laska would be involved in this as the chief investment officer, but he was, and so I'll get that in another video. But Steve Laska and I eventually traveled to Costa Rica together. This would be tracked on our calendars, and Steve Laska met with some property managers and builders, to include the developers Jim and Julian. And his conclusion at the time was that there was not enough homes or income-producing properties in the geographical area to support this new influx, since they built this $35 million airport, and there were a lot more travelers coming into the area. And so he felt that the primary purpose for that property would be to turn it into some form of income producing opportunity, and we would stay open to the possibility of a flip opportunity if that came about because the inventory was low, but that we could build out this property and make it an income producing investment. And this was driven by Steve Laskin. I was involved in it, but I was really letting Steve Laskin make that decision at this thing. A lot had changed down there. I think that Steve Laska's initial valuation was accurate, that money was being pumped into the area. And because of that, and tourism was on the rise, the demand was greater than the supply in the geographical area, and this presented an opportunity for us. There were few high-end homes down there, and so all in all, when we finally collectively sat down, and that group was Steve Laska, Stacy Bean, and myself, and we evaluated Steve Laska's analysis, I agreed with my concerns were more around the loss of focus relative to the advisor acquisition strategy and candidly competing priorities when it came to resources, both money and people. And so what I mean was, we're going to build a home, and this is going to drain capital. I mean, there's no two ways about it. It's going to drain capital. It's going to drain our attention potentially away from the advisor acquisition strategy. And so I agreed that it was a good investment to make, and that even though it would start off as an opportunistic investment, it could be moved into an income-producing investment. I agreed with that analysis, but I just had some concerns about whether or not we were going to get stretched too thin. Now, at some point, and this is probably more geared towards my legal team, Wes, you specifically, I'm going to talk about the individuals, and primarily Steve Laska and Stacy Bean, as well as other staff members that I believe are relevant to our case. But Steve Laska is his biggest weakness is pride, and at this point in 2014 and 2016, although he is very proud of the progress that we made, and I think he would say, and I would say and agree with him, that very few advisory firms could grow at the pace that we grew over those last few years. I think the real issue was that we weren't hitting goal. If you go back to the strategic plan and say, this is what I brought Steve Laskin in to do, and to run this advisor acquisition strategy for us, and the goals we established in the strategic plan each year, and did we meet those? The answer to that was no. And so I think that Steve had a bias, and I was supporting him because I will get to kind of how I treat my staff in another video, and kind of how I led and my perspective on different people. But, Steve Laska brought personal value to me. And so I wanted to see him be successful. And so the idea of him creating and diversifying another revenue stream, I think not only made sense to me, but I also think that in areas where we had raised capital and we were already a little weak in, I thought this enabled us to deploy capital and to justify both of our salaries, both Steve Peters and Steve Laska, going forward. Because candidly, if we weren't growing at the rates that we were going to grow at, and we weren't going to be able to produce cash flow or make significant investments that produce significant returns in kind of short order, then it was going to start to not make sense to have both of us at the same firm, at the salary ranges that we were at. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process, but what you're seeing here is an email from Stacy Bean coming out of a meeting with both Steve Laska and myself, in which she assures me that they have all this covered, and with some additional capital, both her and Steve Laska believe that they will be able to focus on this Costa Rican project, and it's going to be a success. And that's what you're seeing here. Steve Laska agrees with Stacy and says, let's proceed forward. Additionally, we agreed that Stacy would manage and oversee this investment in Costa Rica. She would pursue additional staff, and specifically, she did reach out to Jay Pacello and some financial recruiters, because the area in which we felt that Stacy was struggling the most and managing all the other areas was really the financials. and we did not want that to fail us. And so we were looking for some assistance, and Stacy was tasked to go out and talk to recruiters and see if she could bring in some talent to support that. My staff was absolutely involved in this. We've got to recognize that the first thing that we did was we engaged designers, and the first group that we engaged was actually a Raleigh-based designer, and their names were Oxide, I think is it, and they were an architectural firm in the Raleigh area. They were very modern because Steve Lasker wanted to build a glass house and was looking for a very modern structure. And Steve Lasker, as you see right here, he's the one that actually scheduled the meeting with Charles Holden for February 3rd, 2016. Now, this was our first meeting with the designer, and it was from 2 to 3 p.m., as it shows on this calendar and what you're seeing right now. Now, what you see is directly after having the meeting with Charles Holden and his group that Steve Lasker scheduled a meeting with, we met with David Garcia, who is our architect and our designer, in the original plans that Amy and I had established when we were in Costa Rica. And Stacy Bean and Steve Lasker and I believe Julian, I don't think Jim was on that call, all were on a conference call at our office in downtown Raleigh. And we got on the phone with them and started to describe what we were looking to do and our analysis up to this point. And granted, I mean, they have a bias because they make money. David makes money if we build a house, and obviously as the developers, Julian would like to see his development continue to develop with Premier Homes, but they basically confirmed that every piece of analysis that we gave them and what we were looking to accomplish could be fulfilled, and they were very, very optimistic for us. Now, after our conversations with David Garcia and the other designer that was located, designer and architect here in the Raleigh area, we agreed that David Garcia was really the right person, as he had some hands-on experience as a builder and as an architect and as a designer in Costa Rica. And candidly, another driver was his cost model was much lower than what the other gentlemen were presenting. And for us, that was just because it was an investment property and it wasn't our primary residence. It created a better model from an investment standpoint for Vision Quest Cap. That Steve Peters was not working in a vacuum by himself and taking Vision Quest Capital resources and investing them in a Costa Rican home with a lack of knowledge by everybody else other than Steve Peters and Amy Peters. And candidly, that is the way it has been presented when I read much of the documents, that this is, Steve Peters stole these resources out of Vision Quest Capital and built this luxury vacation home in Costa Rica for his personal use, and that it wasn't designed as an investment, and nobody else knew about what was going on. And so I think I've started to scratch the surface on the fact that that's just not accurate and that's a fallacy. But we're going to dive a little bit deeper, and I'm going to provide you some factual information here that's going to even be more helpful as we proceed forward. So what you're seeing here is an email from me to the entire team, and this email was sent as an update of all the things that are going on at our firm. But in particular, under bullet point number 1, other areas, you're seeing me actually giving Stacy Bean credit for doing a good job in managing our Costa Rica investment. So this email went out to the entire team. So it would be very hard for people to say that they were unaware of the project going on in Costa Rica. Next, what I'm showing you here is an email from Juan Casafant, who is our Costa Rican attorney, and he's actually addressing Steve Lasker, Stacy Bean, and myself regarding questions and providing answers on the investment itself. And in this email, I'm discussing the possibilities of transferring potential ownership of Vision Quest Capital. And you see that my attorney is advising me that there may be better options. And it was shortly thereafter this email, and I'm keeping it up here so that you have the opportunity to read it, but you also hear my voice. is that later Steve Laska and I agreed that the income agreement, this royalty agreement as we described it, was really the best model. And we engaged Ken Carroll. But my point here, and I want to stay on track here, is that my staff was well aware of this structure and this model and was approving it. Next, you see an email from Juan Costa to Stacy Bean giving her power of attorney over the entities in Costa Rica. So to sit here and say, Stacy was in the dark about what was going on in Costa Rica and that we were building this project as this personal residence for Peters is a little ridiculous. In this next email, you see David Garcia actually addressing the team. And the team that is being copied here is Steve Laska and Stacy Bean, as well as myself. And he's discussing next steps. And in this next screenshot, what you're actually seeing is Stacy setting up wire instructions to move money from Vision Quest Capital to the Costa Rican developer builder David Garcia. Emails that you're seeing are both Steve and Stacy signing off on David's proposal from the very beginning. And Stacy's saying here that I think that we will be in a good place. And what she's referring to is my concern around cash flow, from a cash flow perspective. And they had presented to me how they were going to raise capital and which investors and potentially how we would fund this project and the timeline of this project, alongside with using some of the cash that we would get from advisor acquisitions. And so what you're hearing Stacy say here is that I think we're going to be in a good place from a cash flow perspective, and that she can manage it. And then Steve Laska is responding to the proposal and saying, hey, I like it. Let's move forward. So this is really demonstrating that Steve Laska and Stacy Bean were involved in the decision-making, the structure, and the investment in Costa Rica from the very beginning. Now, to claim that this investment in Costa Rica is not an income-producing investment is actually a little ridiculous and kind of funny, because it has been producing in line with the income expectations that we had in the first year, and that you will see described in emails that we were expecting somewhere between $70,000 and $110,000 in the first year. But the government's impact had actually affected us by roughly $22,000 in lost revenue in the first year. And I can prove that because the government's involvement actually created problems with some of the individuals that candidly just didn't want to be involved in renting a home from somebody who they felt was potentially in a Ponzi scheme. And so what you're seeing here is some screenshots that proves that I'm not just making this up, that there were 4 existing contracts that were canceled because of the involvement of the government and the claims that the government has made, resulting in a $22,000 loss in revenue in the last year. The government never makes the claim or reference to the investment agreement that there was between Vision Quest Capital and these Costa Rican entities. Again, these agreements were drafted and created by my attorney, Ken Carroll. Stacy Bean even referenced them in some of her testimony, and they can be tracked by emails. They also correspond to actually some of the emails shown between Juan Casafant and Steve Laska and Stacy Bean and Steve Peters, where Juan is recommending that I don't transfer the equity ownership. And this forces us to come up with a creative kind of out-of-box solution between Steve Laska and myself and Stacy Bean, and then having conversations with my legal counsel, being Ken Carroll, to create this income agreement or investment agreement that defines the structure and the investment that capital made into these entities. Now, we can go conspiracy theory on this whole investment agreement. I'm sure the government is. I mean, that's how they're treating the line of credit, which I'm going to address in another video as well. But It is true that there were multiple versions of this investment agreement, as you can see here, because when we first made the investment and the expenses associated with the project, they unfortunately they just increased. And so what we initially put in the investment agreement and what it ended with had to increase. Now, I personally only have three separate income agreements. I have two for the house, and I have one for the ATVs in my files. Um, it appears that Stacy Bean references one that had been earlier. I cannot locate that one, and I haven't seen it actually in any of the discovery documents in there. The problem with that, and I do recall having discussions with Stacy on this one, is that it did not include the initial purchase of the land, and it certainly didn't include the features, the furniture and the art and things like that that were placed into the house, which increased the cost of the investment made by Vision Quest Capital, let alone the carrying costs associated with HOAs and some other legal fees and builder fees and things like that. So we needed to increase the amount with inside the income agreement that initially was established, and I believe it ended with $850,000 as the investment made by Vision Quest Capital. Additionally, and I find this to be very intriguing, is the fact that one of the income agreements is for the Vision of the Crown, which is a Costa Rican entity that actually holds the ATVs. And Stacy and Steve absolutely know about this entity because they're the ones that purchased the ATVs and placed them into the entity called the Vision of the Crown. So they knew about this income agreement, yet they never reference it, and they were fully aware that this exists. Now, Wes, this is specifically for you. You've told me to kind of put myself in the government's position or seat, and their seat has been one of conspiracy theory. And so taking that conspiracy theory and kind of acting like, hey, this letter of credit, or line of credit that was established between wealth and capital was made up. Let's just assume for a moment that they say this investment agreement was made up, and Peters now is just trying to cover up this perception of this as an investment in this home, as an income-producing investment. But he didn't really have that as his true intentions, and he only came up with that theory when he got in trouble. And so he's trying to cover his tracks here to a certain extent. And so I appreciate that, and I can put myself in their shoes as you've asked me to do. But the problem with that in theory is that the contract itself that was signed June 30th, 2016, this was long before the SEC came in, and long before Peters would have been in trouble. We signed a contract with David Garcia, where on page 2, paragraph 1.2, states that, lastly, David, you need to understand that this investment is not some primary residence or secondary home or some luxury home for just pleasure, that this is a investment property, and that time is of the essence. For every day that we go past not completing this project in time, it is costing us money. And so the idea that this property was being designed as some luxury real estate investment for Peters and his family versus an investment can literally be discredited in the contract itself, which spells out that this is an investment property and time is of the essence. And again, staying in the position of the government, as you've asked me to do, as I try to defend this, I think the next thing is that, this property was never going to really produce income. And we don't have to draw a huge conclusion on this, because they're already telling us that they don't believe that advisory firms are income producing investments and don't fit inside the criteria of an income-producing investment that Vision Quest Capital clearly defines on its website and has for years, as well as in what it's disclosed to clients. And so what I'm going to lean on is just take a look at the last 4 months of bank statements, and you will see that this property has produced nearly $20,000 a month in income off of the Costa Rican property. So in summary, what you're seeing here is the investment agreements, what I like to call the income agreements between Vision Quest Capital and the Costa Rican entities. And as I said before, I don't have all the versions of them. I have 2 that I've been able to locate. I haven't even seen all of them in the discovery material, and maybe that's the reason for why the government has not presented to the public and to the judge that these agreements even existed. But the ones that I have, there's one created in February and then another one in April, and one was for an amount, I believe, $700,000 that you're seeing, and the other one was for $850,000. The third one is for the ATVs, and the ATVs in general cost roughly $30,000, but we put $50,000 in this income agreement because there are ongoing cost and maintenance associated with it. Capital will be making investments into, and so they won't just be reaping the benefit of the income. That there will be some expenditures associated with it, both in insurance and just maintenance of these ATVs. Like I said, I can give the government the benefit of the doubt that maybe they didn't have all of this information, but yet Stacy Bean does talk about this investment agreement that she comes across in the documents, which she didn't come across it. She was very, very well aware of it. She also knew that there was one for the ATVs. I mean, for heaven's sakes, both her and Steve Laska bought the ATVs in San Juan, so there was no way that they didn't know that these ATVs were titled to Vision of the Ground. I mean, as you can see in this document right here, I mean, the actual titles of these ATVs were purchased by Steve and Stacy and placed in the Vision of Crown. So of course they knew that there was an income agreement there. They chose not to communicate that to the government. And Steve Laska knew. Again, for heaven's sakes, he even signed the property management agreement with Jeffrey Perez. As you see here attached, I mean, he's the one who signed the agreement with the property manager. And so sit here and say that Steve Laska did not know that this Costa Rican property and these ATVs were a legitimate investment and were in the dark is just a complete fallacy. In closing, I haven't been able to access all the emails up to this point, but as it pertains to defending the fact that my staff was aware of the investment being made, the investment structure, and the use of Vision Quest Capital proceeds into this investment in Costa Rica, that did fit inside the Vision Quest Capital criteria. I think that I've given enough information to prove that, but we certainly can build upon what I've provided up to this point when we get access to emails and calendars and things like that. Additionally, claiming that this investment was not designed to be income-producing investment and that it was some kind of luxury home for Steve Peters and his, family and for personal use, to me, I think it's a little ridiculous. Now, granted, if you sit here and say it's for Peters' benefit, that's absolutely accurate. Steve Peters owned the Vision Quest Capital entity, and Peters owns the Costa Rican entities. Again, this is an area where I struggle with because my intentions have always been to utilize the other people's money to make more money on it. And that was what Vision Quest Capital was designed to do. I do think we have to anticipate the government stating the fact that we were going to use that Costa Rican property not just to produce income, but for other purposes too as well. And they may point to the fact that Mac DeMall went down there and stayed with a couple and had a wedding down there. Now, granted, they paid to go down there, but there would definitely be times in which Matt or Steve Lask or others would take either clients or prospects or advisors um, down to Costa Rica and utilize it in a way to produce income for Vision Quest Wealth Management or other Vision Quest capital initiatives. And so um, I, I do believe that we need to be prepared for that, but it's not like that we should avoid that. We basically articulate that in the strategic plan in 2017. I mean, you can see right here that I am outlining the fact that we should be utilizing this property when it's available to further the agenda of other Vision Quest capital entities, including Vision Quest Wealth Management, to close prospects, close advisors, and build relationships with existing clients that we're getting to know through the advisor acquisition strategy. I think that what we want to continue to articulate is that this is an income-producing investment, and it does support other initiatives within inside the Vision Quest umbrella. And the investment that we made in this uh, Costa Rican entity and this real estate, as well as the ATV entity, fits within inside the criteria of investments outlined to investors on the Vision Quest Capital website. And we want to highlight the fact that our staff was aware, and even our clients were aware. As you see here, they received a special invite to stay at the home once we completed it. And we even gave them an opportunity, or I did, I took the initiative to forward on the most up-to-date VQ Capital disclosure documents that was attached to this email. And so see this email, but in summary, I believe that this video discredits the fact that my staff was completely in the dark about the investment we were making in Costa Rica, and that this investment that we made in Costa Rica did fit with inside the Vision Quest Capital criteria. And in general, I think that the way the government has presented this investment from Vision Quest Capital into these Costa Rican entities is poorly done and designed, again, to provide almost half-truths to the public, to the judge, to the media, and they are trying to support their case. But quite honestly, it's complete fallacies, and the information itself proves otherwise.